We're going to look at ways in which membrane proteins perform different tasks. And this is very important to know. So we're going to look at letter A first. A and B will kind of fit zoomed in here on this image. So remember that I mentioned that proteins, when they're embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, they can work as a channel or in this case, they kind of function like what's called a pump. So the transport proteins allow for ions or solutes to go in and out of the membrane. The one that's on the left is what's called a hydrophilic channel, so that a solute can just go through it. And this is the solute, what you see here. Other transport proteins are pumps, which means they require ATP. So this ATP molecule, a phosphate is broken off so that once it's broken, remember ADP is present plus a phosphate. And that provides enough energy so this pump can physically move and this solute can go from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. Another important function of proteins is signal transduction. And this is because proteins act as receptors. So you can see the receptor here. So what happens is a protein hormone will bind as the chemical messenger. So let's say, pretend, for example, that this is insulin, a protein hormone. Once it binds, it causes the protein to change shape and initiates a chemical reaction inside of the cell. The next two examples are shown here. They can act as enzymes. Remember how enzymes are proteins. They lower the activation energy of a chemical reaction, and they can transform one substance into another. So there's an active site of the enzyme that may face the outside of the membrane here, because this is the extracellular fluid and this is the intracellular fluid. So it may be the beginning of a metabolic pathway. And remember, metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. The next one is cell-to-cell recognition. And this allows one protein on a membrane to recognize another one. So some glycoproteins, which as you can see by the word, if we break it up, the beginning looks like glycogen, which is a carbohydrate, and the second part is a protein. So it's a combination between two macromolecules. But in this case, the glycoprotein makes up the glycocalyx, and it basically allows one cell to recognize another cell. And then finally, the last two are cell-to-cell joining, which is a specialized type of intercellular junction, like a tight junction or a gap junction, which we'll talk about next. There's also these, what are called CAMs, which stands for cell adhesion molecules. So they basically are, think of them like Velcro. They allow two cells to attach to each other. And then finally, the last function of proteins is the extracellular matrix. So it's an internal skeleton or an internal framework for a cell. So think of it as the bones of the cell. So every cell is not just going to be a blob. It's going to have these very organizational proteins within it, which forms the cytoskeleton. The junctions that I just referenced in the previous slide are shown here. There's three different types, and you should know where they're found. So we have tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. Now, all three of them are not going to be found in one cell. This is just showing you this because it wants to have them all in one graphic, but we need to know the purpose of them and where they're found. So a tight junction is going to be an impermeable type of junction, and it forms a continuous seal around the cell. And it's going to be found in places like the GI tract. So, for example, nutrients that are in the GI tract, you do not want them getting into the blood. So that's why we need these tight junctions, and they don't allow anything to get through. However, this one is really a structural type of protein, whereas the desmosome is an anchoring junction. You can think of it like molecular Velcro, and it prevents cells from tearing apart. So it's going to be in areas of high stress. So one place that you would find this is in the heart muscle as well as the skin. You may not think certainly of as much movement in the skin as the heart, but if you think about the desiccation, the drying up that could happen with the skin, it makes sense. So this is what we call a functional type of junction. And then the last one is also a functional type of junction. And it's going to be found in heart cells as well as embryonic cells. And it allows for the transmission of ions and small molecules, and it uses these proteins called connexons, which really work as tunnels. And in this case, for the heart specifically, they're going to allow the calcium ion to quickly move from one cell to another cell. Our next slide is going to start talking about membrane transport. And when we talk about membrane transport, it's important that you can differentiate them between passive and active. Passive means that it requires no energy input, and there's really technically four different types. So this really should say four. The first one is simple diffusion, and this is the movement of particles from high concentration to low concentration. So it would be things like oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusing in the lungs to enter the bloodstream. Facilitated diffusion means that there is a helper molecule, like a hormone, for example, that moves certain molecules. So one example would be if we had insulin helping to move glucose across the membrane. The third type of passive membrane transport is osmosis, and that's simply the diffusion of water. And then the last one is facilitated, which is the forced movement of molecules. And it's the only one that's forced, and it is going to be due to pressure, like blood pressure. So the higher the blood pressure, the more filtration actually happens. So all types are going to involve diffusion, which really is the natural movement of molecules from a high concentration to low concentration. So since it's going from an area of high concentration to low concentration, it does not require ATP. So imagine that there is a high concentration of particles on this side of the membrane. There's always going to be movement of particles from where there is a greater amount to an area of lesser amount. And we'll see these in more detail next.